The American sports writer Grantland Rice once eloquently wrote an expression that you all know: it doesn't matter if you win or lose, it's how you play the game. Only this morning I want to amend that statement, because when you are not playing sports, at least outside of SEC football, life and death matters are not at stake. But when you are playing a game as high stake as politics, your decisions have a real effect on actual lives. And we know that whether you win or lose matters a great deal. Take, for example, when you do lose at politics, and it's clear that you've lost, and there's a moment that there needs to be a transition of power. This is my emendation here. How you behave, how you play the game matters the most. Because the way that you lose is what people remember, almost as much as what you did. Take, for example, Al Gore. Honestly, I can't tell you a single thing that I remember Al Gore did when he was vice president. I think he may have said he invented the internet. What I remember was the concession speech he gave in the year 2000. That very important speech helped our country to move forward together, and he came out on top. For the opposite, look no further than Aaron Burr, made famous by the Broadway musical Hamilton, that if we didn't see on Broadway, we were lucky enough to see on Disney+. Aaron Burr served heroically in the Continental Army. He was even the Vice President of the United States. But what is he remembered for today? Killing Alexander Hamilton. And why? Because he challenged Hamilton to a duel after he felt that Hamilton cost him the election. Maybe that was a momentary moment of gratification for Burr, but needless to say, he didn't lose graciously. And killing Alexander Hamilton is what he's remembered for today. We all know that it's been a very politically tense couple of weeks for our brothers and sisters living in the land of Israel. They, over 4 elections, have tried to decide the future of their country. The fact that the electorate was so evenly divided after 4 elections reminds us that the stakes could not have been higher. Each side was playing to win. And the events of recent weeks remind us that there was more than just politics. There were real lives at stake. Thankfully, we saw this past Sunday that cooler heads did prevail. Israel put together a coalition that she could be proud of, especially when her critics falsely accuse her of being an apartheid state. The government of Israel today is what Bret Stephens calls, in a very funny turn of phrase, patriotic traitors. A group of parties who courageously put their own country above their own personal politics and interests. You've all heard the statistics by now, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. The government is being led by a right-wing nationalist prime minister. It was assembled by a centrist, and for the first time in Israel's history includes an Arab party in the majority. It does not include any religious parties. 9 women cabinet ministers for the first time. As such, its priorities are not going to be hot-button issues, but normal, everyday matters of government. What did the Prime Minister say? He's looking very much forward to passing a budget for the first time in 3 years. He wants to focus on infrastructure that will be critical to the development of the Jewish state. In many ways, its priorities sound a lot like what we here in the United States are pursuing after our own contentious election, as we, the people, also demand a government that focuses on areas of common ground that can bring our country together. However, for those of us who are committed Zionists, For those of us who are deeply committed to Eretz Yisrael, in this otherwise watershed moment, we have been focused admittedly on something else that also must be acknowledged this Shabbat. And that is that after 12 years in office, Benjamin Netanyahu is no longer the prime minister of the state of Israel. Admittedly, when it came to issues of Jewish pluralism, the prime minister and I shared significant differences. I openly criticized him from this bima for making promises to the diaspora Jewish community and then breaking them. This same habit, I am made to understand from what I have watched on Israeli television, is largely the reason he was not able to compile a coalition from people who shared his own political views. He developed a habit for not keeping his word. That said, after acknowledging the shortcomings of Prime Minister Netanyahu, to not recognize the great impact that he has had on Israel over 12 years would be a mistake this Shabbat. In the past 4 years alone, the American administration officially did its legal obligation and recognized Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish state. Netanyahu organized an effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic, something that is being heralded around the world, and he participated in the groundbreaking Abraham Accords with several new peace treaties and Arab partners from around the Middle East. Folks, that's a legacy we need to celebrate after 12 years in office. Unfortunately, what we saw this past week was not a graceful transition of power, not a man who should have known after 12 years how to play the game. We saw the actions of an amateur and a sore loser. Less Al Gore and more Aaron Burr. If you watch the transition of power on Sunday on television, I watched the clips, you saw members of his coalition heckling the new Prime Minister Naftali Bennett while he spoke, not allowing him to give an introductory address, while he sat there and said nothing. And as Rabbi Danny Gordis pointed out, it has been a tradition from every single Israeli prime minister, unless there's been a health issue that's gotten in the way, that there has been a ceremonial toast between them in their office, advice shared between new and old. Netanyahu refused to go, instead vowing that he would eventually be back in the prime minister's chair. Yaakov Katz of the Jerusalem Post is calling this, quote, a transition that is an insult to the state of Israel. Not somewhat ironically evoking the fact that when Shimon Peres lost to Prime Minister Netanyahu the first time, Prime Minister Peres, at his own political expense, spent 4 days with Netanyahu, helping him to transition to the new office. Things in the Knesset during the transition on Sunday were so bad, members of the coalition so ungracious, that instead of giving a traditional speech, as he is going to be the second prime minister in the rotation, Yair Lapid said this, and I had to quote it directly because it's that powerful of a statement. He says, quote, I'm skipping the speech that I planned to deliver today because I'm here to say one thing, to ask forgiveness from my mother. She's 86 years old, and we didn't ask her to come to Jerusalem lightly. But we did it because I assumed that you would be able to control yourselves and behave with statesmanship in this moment, and she would see a smooth transition of government. You see, when she was born, there was no state of Israel. Tel Aviv was a small town of 30,000 people, and we didn't have a parliament. I wanted her to be here this morning because I wanted her to be proud of the democratic process in Israel. Instead, he said, she, along with every citizen of Israel, is ashamed of you and remembers clearly why it is high time that we replaced you. Thank you. As we begin to head toward the end of our story in the Torah of Moses and the end of Aaron as he passes on this week, I am struck by the graceful exit with which the two carried themselves. In this week's parasha, as I mentioned earlier, Moses hits the rock. It begins the end of his journey of the Jewish people. Aaron turns over his vestments to his son Eleazar. It is the end of his time as high priest. And it is true that if you look at the Bible, the two of them made many mistakes. Moses hits the rock in this week's parasha. Aaron builds the golden calf. Only is this how we choose to remember them? Of course not. Because in this week's parasha and over the next few months as we read the book of Deuteronomy, we will see that Moses and Aaron understood it is, in fact, when you lose how you play the game that matters. Moshe's goodbye speech in Devarim is not perfect. He feels cheated out of his second term in office. He was in office, by the way, twice as long as Bibi Netanyahu. And yet he charges the Jewish people to remain faithful to God. He asks them to follow dutifully after his successor, Joshua. And it is his transition, the peaceful transition of power, the gracious transition of power that cements his legacy. Moses plays the long game. He doesn't play the short one. He plays the game well. And so this Shabbat, I offer these words of advice. My dear former Prime Minister Netanyahu, Bibi, I've watched you for a very long time. You've been part of my life since I was a teenager. I remember how proud we all were when a young man who had grown up in Cheltenham, Pennsylvania, outside of Philly, became the Prime Minister of Israel. A Phillies fan with perfect English. I'm going to be honest, Prime Minister. Like you, I'm not sure I agree that this new government is going to last very long. It may be that it implodes rather quickly and you are back in power soon. As you know, Israeli politicians create new political parties. They betray each other faster than an episode of Game of Thrones. For all I know, you and Bennett may be hugging the next time you see each other in the next government. Only this Shabbat, I want you to remind you, as we read through the parasha, Bibi, don't be that guy. Don't be the guy we remember as being a sore loser who broke with decades of tradition. Lose graciously. Alas, it is highly likely. The one thing this new government is going to pass is a term limit on being the Prime Minister of Israel. So you will never be able to do it ever again. Even if you do win, that means you will never get back into office. And so I ask you, Bibi, don't be that ungracious heckler. Don't be Aaron Burr. Let us celebrate you. Let us be proud of the 12-year journey and celebrate the way that you won the game for 12 long years. This Shabbat, let us all remember at the end of Moses' journey that whether it is in politics or whether it is in life, how you play the game, how you win or lose, really does matter. Shabbat Shalom.